Well, the book of Numbers. The book of Numbers is where we are going to be today. And let's see here. I'm not in the right part of my Bible. Numbers chapter 1 begins very simply with the Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai. Now, as we work our way through the book of Numbers, and as we've been working our way through the Pentateuch, or the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and then eventually Deuteronomy, Numbers picks up really kind of right where Exodus leaves off. And Leviticus is somewhat of a parenthesis, almost a rewind back to Moses on the mountain with the Lord receiving the law. And Numbers now looks forward to the time from Sinai through the wilderness all the way to the edge of the promised land in Moab. And so it covers the time from Exodus at the very end, where Israel is encamped at Sinai, and Numbers picks up from there and deals with the time from Sinai to Moab. Now, fascinating that Exodus covers only about a period of a year, and then Leviticus, a very short period of time while Moses was receiving the word. And then, of course, Numbers, it doesn't cover quite all 40 years in the wilderness, but it does cover about the time span of 38 and a half years of Israel's wilderness, because as we're going to read here in the first few verses, that it's in the second month in the second year after they'd come out of the land that the book of Numbers begins. So that's why we say about 38 and a half years is what the book of Numbers covers. Now, as to its name, the book of Numbers we refer to it that way because we get that title from the Latin translation of the Bible, and its title Numeri, and the Latin translation of the Bible gets it from the Greek, which is arithmoi. But in Hebrew, the actual title is called in the wilderness, and the Hebrew, it takes it straight from that word wilderness, as we just read in that first verse. The Lord spoke to Moses, what? In the wilderness. So the title that we have is fine, because there's a number of censuses, 2 primary censuses, in fact, that deal with all of the numberings of people of the tribes of Israel. And so it's a fine title, nothing wrong with it. There's not one necessarily more important or not, but the Hebrew word really kind of gets at the meat and potatoes of what Numbers is all about, in that there is generally just the covering of the time and the difficulties and the provisions and the corrections and the teachings of the people of Israel as they made their way from Sinai to the promised land. And what we should find, and what we will as we go through the book of Numbers, is that God never really wanted Israel to spend 40 years in the wilderness. The wilderness is not a place that you really hope to set up camp, no pun intended, and stay there for a while, is it? What of all the climates throughout all of the world, there's a number of them, but what is one that generally remains uninhabited? Deserts, right? You don't stay in the desert. You don't stay in the wilderness where there's not plenty of food, where there's not plenty of water, where there's not plenty of resources to sustain life. And yet what we'll find through the book of Numbers is that God sustains his people all the way through the wilderness wanderings. I mean, think about this. God provided food for them every day. He's going to provide water for them out of the rock. He's going to provide all of these different types of things in the desert, in the wilderness. And not only this, God is going to make sure that their sandals don't wear out for 40 years. I don't think I've ever had a pair of shoes that's lasted more than 1 year. I tend to be hard on shoes, and you can imagine all of the ground that they're covering, right, in the wilderness. The Lord is going to provide for them, and I think at times we can so identify with this experience, because how many times have we found ourselves in a wilderness of our life where it's uncomfortable, we don't really enjoy what's going on, we don't really want to stay there, we know that there's a place that we're headed to, and yet it is prolonged for a number of reasons, sometimes through our own stubbornness and through our own disobedience. But we also endure wildernesses of different times and kinds, and it's not comfortable, and yet what do we find throughout it all, even though we don't understand it always? The Lord's providing for us. We have everything we need from Him, and He causes things to be sustained that shouldn't otherwise be sustained given the conditions. So, the book of Numbers. I am very excited about this. Now, the main focus, or you could say really kind of the main, not really themes, but the things that it really covers is this. So Leviticus covered about a month, covered the law. Exodus covered about a year, covered the oppression and the deliverance of the people of Israel. Numbers covers 38 years, and it again covers those wilderness wanderings and some of the details about that. How the camp would be arranged, who would have charge over what elements within the camp, and responsibilities, so on and so forth. I have a map there. It's not the next slide, but this is a map. Now, just a note on this map. This is the second part of their wandering from Kadesh to Moab. And there's a number of different ideas of where they exactly traveled. I did not include their travels from Sinai to Kadesh. And the reason for that is because, remember when we were going through Exodus, there's a difference of opinion on where Mount Sinai actually is. And most of the maps have it in where traditional Sinai is, there in the Sinai Peninsula. But if you remember, according to this map, I'm convinced, again, I don't know this with biblical certainty, but I'm persuaded that Sinai is actually on the other side, on this side, further south than what is considered Midian by most, but I believe is also, anyway, that's where Sinai is. Anyway, they made it down from the wilderness down there up to Kadesh, and then from Kadesh to Moab, just on the other side of the Jordan, from the land that the Lord was going to give them. So it took them a long time. It took them a long time. When you consider the amount of land that was traversed in a relatively short period of time, a matter of weeks, from Egypt all the way to Sinai in the wilderness there, and the amount of time it took Israel to get to the promised land from Sinai, it really just puts things into perspective. They were there for a long time, but it didn't have to be that way. And one of the reasons was because of their own stubbornness and rebellion. As we continue through our introduction, the book of Numbers, again, can be a picture for us as an assurance that God is with us, especially in the wilderness experiences of our own life. And what we'll come to find as we chart our way through Numbers is this: God didn't give up on Israel. There were a number of points of rebellion, severe rebellion, that Israel engaged in idolatry. And not only this, their leader, Moses, he lost his temper with them. He was told to speak to the rock, and what did he do? He smacked it twice because he was frustrated. And that was one of the reasons, actually, that was primarily the reason that the Lord did not allow Moses to enter the promised land. You'll see, and we'll see through Numbers, the flesh come to the center and be reasons for complications that come up in God's plan. Yet God didn't give up on Israel, even though they were very fleshly. His promises remained for them, even though, listen to this, the generation that entered the wilderness and that saw the deliverance and experienced all of those provisions, they were not the ones who would make it into the promised land. There would only be two people from the generation of the wilderness wanderings who would make it into the land. And we know them to be Joshua and Caleb. They were the faithful spies who went. And we'll read about them here in this book. Here's the main three themes that I believe we'll see in this book. And the first is this: difficulty arises when God's children are rebellious and disobedient. We can tend to make our life a lot harder than it has to be because of disobedience. God had just given them the law, and some things only pertain to when they made it into the land, but generally, they were to walk in accordance with those laws from Sinai, from when they received it, and from when they entered the covenant. And we see that all the way back in Exodus chapter 20. God had standards for his children to walk by, and it got a lot more difficult, and there were consequences for their rebellion and disobedience. So difficulty comes when we don't obey God. The second theme is this: God has given his people every reason to believe and to obey. We're going to see God provide in miraculous ways, as he already has for the children of Israel. He's offered to bring them into a covenant where he will be their God and they will be his people, that he will care for them, provide for them, and see to it that everything they need they'll have from his hand. And yet, from theme number one, they don't always perfectly obey. And we don't know either. But God has given us every reason to believe him and to obey him. What term of the covenant, whether positive or consequential, and in the negative sense of that word, did he not uphold? Everything he upheld. And even beyond that, he provides miraculously for them through the wilderness. He provides for them faithfully. There's every reason we have to obey him and to believe his word, that he is going to follow through. And here's the third theme: God remains faithful to his promises, even when we are faithless. And he's patient. I mean, if you want to tag a fourth one on there, he's patient, isn't he? I don't know that, I'm not God. And if I were consistent with his character, especially in the aspect of patience perfectly, I'm sure I wouldn't act like this, but I know my flesh would not be as patient as he was with the people of Israel in their wilderness wanderings. He's so patient, and he remains faithful to his promises even when we are faithless. There's a whole generation that didn't enter the promised land. Moses didn't enter the promised land. But God still followed through with his promises. He was faithful even through the disobedience of his people. And I've got a really brief outline for you. Hopefully it will, kind of frame the book. So the outline is really broken down into three sections. The first is Israel preparing to leave Sinai. In chapter 1 through chapter 10, verse 10, is really the the instructions that are given, the marching orders, so to speak, the arrangements of the camp, and the responsibilities, especially for the Levites and all the different groupings of the Levites as they take the tabernacle and who's responsible for what as they carry it, how the camp should be set up in the different places that they will settle down. So preparing to leave Sinai, chapter 1 through chapter 10, verse 10. The second section covers the actual travel from Mount Sinai to Kadesh. So chapter 10, verse 11 to chapter 20, verse 21. And then from chapter 20, verse 22 to chapter 36, verse 13, we have their travel from Kadesh to the plains of Moab, which was that last slide that I showed you with the map. So it really, those are the three main divisions. I could break it down much, much more, but we're going to do that by way of really kind of how we walk through the book. So that really kind of helps to frame where we are in this book. And then in the first chapter of Numbers, the Lord commands Moses to take a census of all of Israel, the people of Israel, but really those who were able to go to war. And so that's the number that we find here in chapter 1, a census of the people. Let's read in verse 1. The Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai in the tent of meeting on the first day of the second month, in the second year that they had come out of the land of Egypt, saying, take a census of all the congregation of the people of Israel by clans, by fathers' houses, according to the number of names, every male, head by head, from 20 years old and upward, all in Israel who are able to go to war. You and Aaron shall list them company by company. And there shall be with you a man from each tribe, each man being the head of the house of his fathers. And so it goes on down to list each of those leaders of the different clans from the tribes of the men who were able to go to war. So there's 12 different tribes from which these names would come, and we know that there's one tribe as we go through this that won't be among this list, and that would be the Levites. They are not counted as those who would go to war. They were to tend to the things of the tabernacle and to the sacrifices. So, the census of Israel's warriors. Now, as you go down through these, the actual census, the first is Reuben. And in verse 21, we have 46,500 who are listed there. The tribe of Simeon, verse 23, 59,300. Gad, verse 25, 45,650. Verse 27, we have Judah, 74,600. Verse 29, Issachar, 54,400. Verse 31, Zebulun, 57,400. Ephraim, 40,500. Manasseh, 32,200 in verse 35. Verse 37, tribe of Benjamin, 35,400. Verse 39, the tribe of Dan, 62,700. Verse 41, Asher, 41,500. Verse 43 is the last that we have in Naphtali, and that is 53,400. In verse 46, we have that all tallied up there, 603,550. So this is the total number of men able to go to war who have come out of Egypt and who were a part of the land. And of course, there's estimates that range, but if this is only the males who are able to go to war and that's who is being counted during this time. You can conservatively estimate that there are anywhere between 2 million and 2.5 million people, give or take, and it could even be more. And of course there's questions like, okay, well really, how is this going to work? Because we're going to see all of the layout of the camp, and how could 2.5 million plus people be arranged in this camp, and how could that actually work? I don't really think that those things could take place, and it just doesn't make sense. They didn't have the infrastructure and all this, on and on and on and on all of that. Listen, this, when you start to look at the numbers and you see the geographical footprint of some of the cities and all of that we have today, it's really not hard to see all of this taking place. And even though we might not quite understand how all of those people fit in the footprint of the camp, and some people would even go to the degree of saying it couldn't have been that many people, it had to be way less, had to be much, 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 much fewer. But when you consider the whole narrative of Israel's deliverance out of Egypt, and you consider the promises that the Lord gave to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, and all the descendants, what specific aspect of the promise is there? I'm going to make you what? Your descendants are going to be as many as the stars, right? As many as the sands of the sea. They're going to be so many. The promise of God was a multitude of the nation, not just a little bit. And then when Israel was still in Egypt, what was the reason that Pharaoh increased the oppression of Israel? They were afraid, what? That they were going to be taken over. That Israel was becoming so many that they would be overtaken and overrun by Israel. And that's one of the reasons that the oppression of Israel was increased. So I don't think, of course, Scripture presents the number very plainly here, and I don't think there's any reason for us to think that it was a much lesser number. This was a miraculous work of God, and surviving and delivering the people out of Egypt, and then also causing them to survive and be sustained through the wilderness. It is a work of God, and I think it's just a testament to this. Verses 47 down through 54, we read that the Levites were not included. So you just add on to the number. Okay, the Levites aren't even included in this number. And then you add women and children, and then even those who were not able to go to war. And you can see how very easily you could get to a number of 2 million or more. So, the people of Israel were counted. We'll cover this when we get to this section later, but you just might want to note when there's another census that is made, the difference in the numbers between this chapter and when the second census takes place. So, we'll cover that then. I don't want to take time to do that tonight, but we'll come back around to that thought. Chapter 2, here is where we have how God wanted the camp to be arranged. With each of these encampments, there would be a banner. There would be a color for each of the different facings and specific directions of how the Lord wanted the camp to be arranged. Verse 1, the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, the people of Israel shall camp, each by his own standard, with the banners of their fathers' houses. They shall camp facing the tent of meeting on every side. Those who camp to the east side toward the sunrise shall be of the standard of the camp of Judah by their companies. Verse 5, so I'm going to skip a few verses just to kind of get the arrangement without the repetition of the numbers. So verse 5, to those to camp next to him shall be the tribe of Issachar. And then verse 7, then the tribe of Zebulun. So you have Judah and Issachar and Zebulun all together. And then verse 10 on the south side, and you can go ahead and put the map up there. On the south side, you'll have Reuben. Verse 12, also Simeon. And then verse 14, the tribe of Gad. And then just as you continue all the way down through the chapter, again, he's just arranging the encampment there all around. And so you've got 3 tribes on 4 sides, which is 12, right? So you've got all the 12s all around, and then you go inside that second layer from the outside, and that's where you actually have the Levites. So there were different families even within the Levites. Remember, it's important for us to remember that only the sons of Aaron were to be the priests. So there were other functions from the tribe of Levi, many more people than just the sons of Aaron. And so the priests were there in front of the tabernacle. They were there ready to take care of it. But then you have the Kohathites, Gershon, and the Merarites, who also encamped around. And at the very center, you have there the tabernacle, the presence of God. Verse 34 kind of just summarizes this, and it says, "Thus did the people of Israel, according to all that the Lord commanded Moses. So they encamped by their standards, and so they set out, each one in his clan, according to his father's house." So you've got the tribe around on the outside. You've got the priests there in the middle. You have the Lord, the tabernacle, the presence, the pillar of fire, the cloud of smoke, the Shekinah glory. And with some of the other instruction that they'll have, that we'll see, you just get the sense that the Lord, and this is the title of tonight's study, is that God was at the center of everything. And that's what he wanted for the people. It was to be at the center of the Levites' service. It was to be at the center of life for all of Israel. And they were, in fact, supposed to set up their tents to face the tabernacle, so that the first thing when they go out in the morning, they'll see the presence of the Lord. So that they are always having God on their mind. That whatever they do, the first thing that they see in the morning, it's the Lord. As they go in and out, they're reminded the Lord is with them. And they are there for him and for his purposes. There's so much meaning that could be drawn from this. But what encouragement do we have as believers to remember that the Lord is at the center of everything and should be at the center of everything? Our whole life, it's about him. He desires to be at the center of our heart and our life, at the center of our priorities, at the center of our engagements, at the center of everything that we do and set out to do in our life. The Lord wants to be at the center of it. This verse just keeps coming up time and again. Again, Matthew 6:33, right? Seek first the kingdom of God. All these things will be added to you. And what we'll see through Numbers is that they didn't do that perfectly, did they? In fact, there's a lot of times where they just weren't seeking the Lord at all. And what devastation and what consequence comes from a life that does not have the Lord at the center. Oh, how we need to keep the Lord at the center of everything. Everything that we do individually, everything that we do as a fellowship, everything about us must have the Lord at the center. And then, of course, you have the priests who are there on the inside, which is almost just another picture of a mediator, a mediator between the people and God, and that the priests and the tribe of Levi served as that mediating tribe between the Lord and the rest of the people. And we know that Jesus is our great high priest, the one who mediates on our behalf and intercedes on our behalf and goes before the Father on our behalf. And it is for this reason, him being our great high priest, that we have confidence, that we can approach the throne of grace boldly, because the Lord goes before us. He is our great high priest. Now, in chapters 3 and 4, we're not going to read a ton of chapter 3 and really not much of chapter 4 at all. But there are particular Levitical responsibilities that are charged to the Levites. And think of these responsibilities especially, less about the sacrifices that are to be given, but more about who's responsible for what when the encampment moves, right? So the tabernacle, we know, was a portable structure. There were posts, there were fabrics, there were utensils, there were elements that were to be moved, and when Israel moved as an encampment, someone had to be responsible to take care of those things and to see that they were tended to. Verse 1 in chapter 3 says, "These are the generations of Aaron and Moses, the time when the Lord spoke with Moses on Mount Sinai. These are the names of the sons of Aaron: Nadab, the firstborn, and Abihu, Eleazar, and Ithamar." We know Nadab and Abihu, they were struck dead, right? We don't know specifically why, but they offered vain fire, or the word escapes me, but strange fire, profane fire, there you go, before the Lord. Verse 3, "These are the names of the sons of Aaron, the anointed priests, whom he ordained and served as priests. But Nadab and Abihu died before the Lord when they offered unauthorized fire before the Lord in the wilderness of Sinai, and they had no children. So Eleazar and Ithamar served as the priests in the lifetime of Aaron and their father." So you do the math. 50% of the priests during the time of Moses and Aaron, aside from Aaron himself, they were taken out of commission. Verse 5, "And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, 'Bring the tribe of Levi near and set them before Aaron the priest, that they may minister to him. They shall keep guard over him and over the whole congregation before the tent of meeting, as they minister at the tabernacle. They shall guard all the furnishings of the tent of meeting, keep guard over the people of Israel as they minister at the tabernacle.'" Fascinating that they would keep guard over all the people and they're at the center. Have you ever thought about that? They would keep guard over the people, and yet the fringes, the priests aren't on the outside of all the tribes, they're on the inside. They kept guard because they kept guard spiritually over the people. And so they kept guard. Verse 9 said, "You shall give the Levites to Aaron and his sons. They are," listen, "wholly given to him from among the people of Israel. And you shall appoint Aaron and his sons, and they shall guard their priesthood. But if any outsider comes near, he shall be put to death." You know that verse 9, they, the tribe of Levi, Aaron and his sons, they are wholly given to him from among the people of Israel. If you are part of the tribe of Levi, your responsibilities were already determined. You didn't get to choose. You didn't get to long after what the other tribes could do. God had chosen you for a particular purpose. And what a privilege it would be to minister in the tabernacle, to minister the sacrifices if you were a priest, to minister to and tend to the things of the tabernacle. You were completely and totally given over your whole life to the purposes of God for you. You were of the tribe of Levi. What pictures do we have to the New Testament as believers? Because we have been entrusted to the spiritual work of God's house in his kingdom. In fact, you think about this, any descendant that was to come from the tribe of Levi, their roles were determined by God even before they were born. Think about that. Now, we as believers in the New Testament church, we have works that God has prepared beforehand for us, Paul says in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 10. We've been saved by grace. It's a gift of God. But Paul says we are his workmanship, masterpiece. We've been created in Christ Jesus for good works that he created beforehand. The implication is before we were even born, like what the Lord told Jeremiah. Even before you were formed in your mother's womb, I called you to this, Jeremiah, the Lord said. God has called us and uniquely appointed to us spiritual work to accomplish in his name. And we should walk in it fully because we are the priests of God's house. We are New Testament priests. And so first we should consider it a privilege that God would give us work to do in the first place. That he would count us, in view of Christ's work, worthy to engage in these works, ministering to the body and ministering to him as we do. But not only this, what was the description there in verse 9? They are wholly given to him. This means that everything else in their life was secondary. This was to be their whole life. This was to be preeminent in their life. Their role in serving God. And while we don't have the exact same ministry as the priests did there in the tabernacle, and while we as believers don't necessarily have the same constraints on us as, say, a Levitical priest would, we are called to be wholly given over to the work and to the purposes of God for our life. In fact, the call to believers and the call to the followers that Jesus said is that you need to be prepared to leave everything. My desires for you, my wants for you, my commands for you, the particular things I want you to go and do in my name, those things rise to the top now. And your priorities, your everything else, it needs to settle to the bottom. And so I think it's a good place for us just to again reflect, like, Lord, okay, search my heart. I mean, are there any aspects of my life that I'm wanting to lift to the surface because I don't want to give that up in my time. I don't want to give that up from my work. I don't want to give that up from my hobbies. I don't want to rearrange my calendars. I don't want to rearrange my schedule. I don't want to rearrange my priorities. I like what I do. Because at times, God will call us to make some radical and hard changes with our lives if we are not wholly given over to his purposes for our life. And so ask the Lord. Be free with this, because there is no better place to be and no better thing to be doing than what God wants us to be doing. They're wholly given over to them. That's a good pattern for us. May we be wholly given over to the Lord in everything that he wants for us. So the Levites, they were charged to care for the things of the tabernacle, and of course the priests were to administer the sacrifices. Now, as you continue through chapter 3, specifically verses 14 down through verse 39, you have the breakdown of all of the different groups of the Levites and their responsibilities. And so I have there should be another picture. I think it's after the fourth one. But the text is probably hard to read, but you can see the different breakdown of all of the different elements that were to be carried and cared for. All right, so you have there at the very bottom the Kohathites. They were in charge there of the altar, the table, lampstand, golden altar, veil, the ark. You also have the Gershonites there who were caring for the hangings of the court, the curtains of the tabernacle, the screen for the door, the screen for the entrance, and then you have the Merarites who carried the pillars and the frames and the structural elements there for the outer wall. And so you just see they each had a responsibility. They each had aspects of that to care for. And in chapter 4, there's really just a repeating in further detail of all of the different responsibilities for these groups. And so you can go ahead and read that on your own. It's not that it's not beneficial, but again, it's just further detail about other Levitical responsibilities for them. And in Numbers chapter 5, we have 3 different particular laws that God gives to the people. Verse 1 through verse 4, this is a law about unclean people. Verses 5 to verse 10, if there was any a wrong that was to be done, a sin or anything like that, then there was restitution that was to be made, and they should confess it to the Lord and offer a sacrifice. And then verse 11 down through the rest of the chapter, verse 31, it's a very interesting law as it relates to a man and his wife. We'll read that whole section. Won't take a whole lot to talk about it, but anyway, it's pretty fascinating. Verse 1 says, "The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Command the people of Israel that they put out of the camp everyone who is leprous or who has a discharge, and everyone who is unclean through contact with the dead. You shall put out both male and female, putting them outside the camp, that they may not defile their camp, in the midst of which I dwell. And the people of Israel did so, put them outside the camp as the Lord had said to Moses. So the people of Israel did." To us, as we read that, it may sound harsh, but the Lord is not being harsh here. What's being communicated here is that I'm holy. And there are things that I'm not going to permit in my presence. I'm in the midst of the camp. I am here. Now, some of these things, it wouldn't be their fault that they contracted these things necessarily. I mean, who goes out and willfully wants to contract leprosy so that they can't be in the midst of the camp, they can't be around loved ones, on and on and on, and all of these types of things? No, of course, nobody does that. Nobody wants to go and do that and makes themselves unclean through something, being in contact with the dead. But the Lord draws a line. He says, I'm holy. And those who are unclean for these purposes, they need to be taken outside of the camp. Which is interesting when you consider the work of Jesus. We covered this when we went through the Levitical law. But Jesus went outside of the camp for us, didn't he? He was crucified. He took upon himself there outside of the camp all of the uncleanness that you could possibly imagine from all of time and humanity. In his body on the cross outside the walls of Jerusalem, outside the camp as it were, as the writer of Hebrews says, he laid down his life as a sacrifice to purify us and to cleanse us. And so he did this. He did this willingly. And of course, we know the benefits and the fruits of that sacrifice. But the Lord is holy. That's why you have that momentary forsaking where Jesus says, Father, why have you forsaken me? He cries out on the cross. There's a breaking of fellowship that takes place with uncleanness. And so the Lord says, you guys need to go out of the camp. And further, there are some hygienic purposes for this, so that those who have a communicable disease such as leprosy would not then perpetuate that by being in the midst of the camp. Which is fascinating when you consider some of the charges that Paul gives to the church and some of the phrasings that are given there, that when there is a severe and intentional and unrepentant sin that is within the church or within a member of the church, the charge is to remove that person from the fellowship so that it does not spread. And so there comes a time, very difficult, but it's a much more complicated issue than just simply saying there's a time where people are asked to be removed from fellowship in the midst of a church. But there are those times, and the reason is to maintain the holiness and to maintain the purity of the camp of God, as it were. And the same thing was true there in Israel. Verses 5 to 10, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the people of Israel, when a man or woman commits any of the sins that the people commit by breaking faith with the Lord, and that person realizes his guilt, he shall confess his sin that he committed, and he shall make full restitution for his wrong, adding a fifth to it and giving it to him to whom he did the wrong." So repay, add a fifth to it. If the man has no next of kin to whom restitution may be made for the wrong, the restitution for wrong shall go to the Lord, for the priest, in addition to the ram of atonement, with which atonement is made for him. So if the restitution couldn't be made to any kin, if someone, say, was killed and there was no other person who would actually be able to receive that restitution, then that would go to the tabernacle and to the Lord. Verse 9, every contribution, all the holy donations of the people of Israel, which they bring to the priest, shall be his. So it be given to the priest. Verse 11, down through the rest. We're not going to read the whole section, but this is a very interesting law. It deals with infidelity and adultery. We'll read down to a section, probably verses 11 through 15, and then we'll come back to the very end of this section. But in verse 11 it says, "The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the people of Israel, if any man's wife goes astray and breaks faith with him, if a man lies with her sexually and it's hidden from the eyes of her husband, and she is undetected, though she has defiled herself, and there is no witness against her, since she was not taken in the act, and if the spirit of jealousy comes over him, and he is jealous of his wife who has defiled her, or if the spirit of jealousy comes over him, and he's jealous of his wife, though she has not defiled herself, then the man shall bring his wife to the priest and bring the offering required of her, a tenth of an ephah of barley or flour. He shall pour no oil on it and put no frankincense on it, for it is a grain offering of jealousy, a grain offering of remembrance, bringing iniquity to remembrance." The next section, really verses 16 down through the rest of it, details what will happen. So there's a certain bitter water that the priest will make, and the accused wife will be there and will ingest that particular concoction. And if the wife is guilty, then there's kind of a wasting away, a deterioration of her body that takes place. verse 22, it says, verse 21, it says, then the Lord make you a curse and an oath among your people when the Lord makes your thigh fall away and your body swell. May this water that brings the curse pass into your bowels and make your womb swell and your thigh fall away. But if she was not committing adultery, if she had not defiled herself and her husband, then there would be no negative impact on her. Pretty interesting here, right? I think the interesting element, two in particular. One, if the man was jealous, and we know how there can be some men who are almost to the point of being oppressively jealous of their wife. But if this was the case, whether the woman had committed adultery or not, there was a process where that husband, if he was suspicious, he could send her to the priest. If she was found faithful, the Lord would see to it that drink would not affect her. It was in a sense a way to verify the truth, a way to see the truth come to the surface. And of course, if she had, then there would be some severe consequences. But the other aspect of it is the Lord essentially says to the wife, you have to go anyway, even if you've done nothing wrong. Your husband has the right to send you if he's suspicious. Verse 29, this is a law in cases of jealousy. When a wife, though under her husband's authority goes astray and defiles her, or when a spirit of jealousy comes over a man and he is jealous of his wife, then he shall set the woman before the Lord, and the priest shall carry out for her all this law. The man shall be free from iniquity, but the woman shall bear her iniquity. So, what do we learn from this? Well, if you are a woman who was married to a very, very jealous and suspicious of you man, then it may be somewhat of a difficulty. And for the man, up until the point where she returns home from the presence of the priest, it may be okay. But as soon as she comes home, it probably wouldn't be very good for him, let's say, right? Because it's like, what do you do that? What'd you do that for? Anyway, you can just imagine all of the situations that may come up from that. But the point is, when a man and a woman are married, the vows need to be esteemed and they need to be honored. We need to walk in faithfulness. So if you're married, walk in faithfulness. If you're not, walk in faithfulness until that day. Walk in faithfulness and purity before the Lord, that you may enter a covenant should the Lord, and a marriage should the Lord be leading you into that with a clear conscience and nothing to be guilty of. Chapter 6, verses 1 through 21 covers the Nazirite vow. Verse 2, it says, speak to the people of Israel, say to them, whether a man or a woman makes a special vow, the vow of a Nazirite, to separate himself to the Lord, he shall separate himself from wine and strong drink. Shall drink not vinegar made from wine or strong drink, and shall not drink any juice or grapes or eat grapes fresh or dried. All the days of his separation he shall eat nothing that is produced by the grapevine, not even the seeds or the skins. So you had to abstain from anything from the vine or from the fruit of the vine. Verse 5 says, all the days of his vow of separation, no razor shall touch his head. Till the time is completed for which he separates himself to the Lord, he shall be holy. He shall let the locks of hair of his head grow long. And verse 6, all the days he separates himself to the Lord, he shall not go near a dead body, not even for his father or for his mother, for brother or sister if they die, shall he make himself unclean, because of his separation to God is on his head. All the days of his separation, he is holy to the Lord. So you could present yourself to the Lord for a particular purpose, particular season to dedicate yourself. And of course, one of the most famous we know is Samson. And we know the difficulties there and how he did not walk out his his Nazirite vow completely on a number of fronts. And we know, of course, his hair was cut. We know that he took honey from inside of a decaying body of a lion, I think it was. And he broke the vow. And what we see is that after he broke the vow, the power of God wasn't there. And it's particularly noted, of course, after his hair was cut. But the power of that vow and the power upon Samson wasn't because his hair was long. It wasn't because necessarily he had refrained from being near any dead thing or coming into contact with any dead thing. It's because he was given over to God. And that those were things that demonstrated his commitment to God. It wasn't the things themselves. Those were mere markers of his commitment to faithfulness to the Lord. Not only this, they would have to give particular offerings as well. And the point is this: to dedicate oneself to the Lord, it costs something. It costs a lot. It affects your family relationships. I mean, think about that. If your father or your mother dies, or your brother or your sister, can't go near him because you're mine. It affects what you eat and what you consume. It affects those things that may defile you should you come in contact with them in life. Making sure that we preserve ourselves unto the plans of God for us. We talked about vows the last time, but if you make a vow to the Lord, be prepared to fulfill it. But regardless, we've committed our lives to Him, and those things that He's told us to avoid, and those things that He's told us to commit to, we need to hold to those and make sure. And at times, there are even more stringent things that we might commit to for a season of our life, that we may serve the Lord. And it can come across in some different ways. One of the aspects is fasting. You know, we can say for a period of time, Lord, I'm going to seek your face. I'm going to dedicate myself on another level by denying myself these things. And it could be a traditional fast of food. It could be a hybrid fast of some sort. It could be even a fast from other different types of things. But what you're saying is, I am going to deny myself these things that I might give myself to you more wholly, or because I want to hear from you. And I think fasting is something that we need to walk in as believers. There's nothing legalistic about it, but the expectation, as the Lord teaches His disciples, is that they would be fasting, not that they should be fasting. Oh, how we need to fast. And that doesn't have to be from food. It doesn't have to be from these. We need to be led by the Lord in how we fast. But it could be media. It could be social media. It could be any number of things. The Lord could call you to fast from a lunch one day a week. Whatever it is. And if the Lord convicts you to do that, or however He leads you, make a pattern of fasting in your life. Not for any other purpose other than to give yourself to the Lord for the time that you're fasting. Not for any other purpose. There's benefits. There's other things. And so I think this would be a good thing for us, especially as we head into, Easter's coming up. And in a tradition in the church has been, or sections of the church has been, especially in the tradition that I grew up in the Methodist church, period of Lent from Ash Wednesday to Easter. And it's a period of 40 days where you fast from something. If you observe that and you do that, that's awesome. But regardless, I think as we head up into Easter, it may be a good thing for us as a fellowship to fast and to ask the Lord to do a deep work in our hearts first, but that He may do a work as the word goes forth and as we have opportunity to share with others in this season about the Lord, and that we might not miss anything that He wants us to do. And so Consider that. See how the Lord may want to incorporate fasting into your life if it's not already a routine. And routine in the best sense of it, a pattern of our life. Not that it just becomes, something you do, but that it's a part of your life and your walk with the Lord. And we close with verses 22 through 27. Probably the part of Numbers, if there is one, that we are most familiar with. So the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to Aaron and his sons, saying, Thus you shall bless the people of Israel. You shall say to them, The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. So shall they put my name upon the people of Israel, and I shall bless them." Those three elements: the Lord bless you and keep you. Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. Lift up his countenance upon you, give you peace. Oh, how we need the blessing and the keeping of God. Oh, how we need his face to shine upon us and to be gracious to us. Oh, how he might lift our face and give us peace. But verse 27, it says, "So shall they put my name upon the people of Israel, and I will bless them." May we be those who bear the name of Jesus. May we be those who, in a sense, put the name of God upon his people as the priests in the church. And may we walk